or should I say good evening. It's getting to that time of the day. So thank you so much for joining us for this panel. My name is Suzanne Lynch. I'm Chief Brussels Correspondent with POLITICO, covering the EU and EU affairs pretty much on a daily basis in Brussels. So it's very nice for me, the journalist, to get over here, the other part of the continent. I think we are all a bit guilty in Brussels of being very focused on the West sometimes and those older member states of the EU. So very nice to get some fresh perspectives at the forum this week. Thank you very much for joining us for our panel, The Return of Deterrence, Building Resilience Through Preparation. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our two speakers who are joining me for this discussion. Antonia Colibasanu, author and analyst with Geopolitical Futures, and Jānis, Sārts, Director, NATO Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence. So thank you both for joining us for this discussion. Look, just to start things off, Jānis, maybe I'll start with you. I mean, obviously a very delicate time at the moment in terms of what's happening with the war in Ukraine, and an opportune time to think about the concept of deterrence. Is the war, have the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, that full-scale invasion last year, has that proof that deterrence has actually failed?
Well, classical deterrence absolutely has not failed. I think there are two aspects to the classical deterrence. One is a nuclear deterrence, that's the origin of the concept. And in that sense, I would argue the Western deterrence has limited Putin's appetite to go beyond what is the nuclear rhetorics, that's clearly. Second element, I think when we look at Russia, it has clearly demonstrated clear-cut unwillingness to do anything that makes NATO or the West enter the conflict. So in that sense, it has not failed. But what has failed is what we started to perceive as a deterrence, but I don't think it is quite that, and that is by just the sheer power of the West, both militarily and economically, instilling this factor of, not challenging West. And that has absolutely failed, I agree. We know by now that many of the analysts have said that one of the factors in Putin's decision-making to launch the invasion was this idea of disunified West, and I would argue post-pandemic, few would be arguing with that. So that part, but I would not qualify that quite as a deterrence.
Yeah, so in terms of nuclear threat so far, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's worked. Yeah.
There is a twist.
Yeah.
And I think that twist is going to have an impact in the way the world will be viewing nuclear. And I think the twist is the way Russia and Putin personally has been using the nuclear rhetoric, or kind of the threat of nuclear attack, as a way to limit the decision-making of the West in the support of Ukraine. And I don't think it will be lost on quite a few players around the world, so we'll see the ramifications of that in the future.
Yeah, interesting. Antonia, your views on this about deterrence, about what it says about the policy of deterrence, this Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, basically, I fully agree with you that so far, so good with regards to nuclear. However, the question of how Russia specifically looks at nuclear in terms of using that as a threat to the West and using that threat in the propaganda scheme is something new, as well as it is the use of tactical weapons and weapons of mass destruction that are not necessarily only nuclear, and that are being discussed as well in the Russian propaganda and by us, the West, as a potential threat. So I think we went up, as an analyst now, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing that we went up another layer when it comes to how we'll look at deterrence and how we should actually build up deterrence in the future. Because if we are to analyze what's going on right now, in Ukraine, even if the kinetic warfare is to end tomorrow, the war itself will not end. And that's key for us to understand with regards to deterrence.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, getting back to the idea of the classic understanding of deterrence and nuclear deterrence, but apart from that though, I mean, the facts are that, you know, or one could argue that maybe the response or lack of response by the West and Europe to all these moves by Russia, you know, in Georgia in 2008, the US, most notably then in 2014, the Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, that, you know, that obviously emboldened, you know, the calculation was that he won't, you know, that contributed, arguably led to the Russian decision to invade.
Well, absolutely, but I think in a way what we have to understand is if there's a lesson that those that want to mean harm to the West are taking out of it, is going to the full-scale hot war is not the best way forward. Because I would argue they've been rather successful to undermining democratic processes in many of our countries. They've been quite good at interfering in a number of elections across the years. They've been disrupting ability to make the decisions in the country in quite a successful ways. And it took a cataclysmic event like we've seen in Ukraine, and in large part also the fact that Ukrainians decided to fight, which we now take for granted. But in the early weeks, that was very much up in the air. And from that, the lesson is the first part, kind of interfering in a subtle ways into democracy, and we didn't have a good response until, I think, recently.
I was going to pick you up on this now that you've raised it. It's very interesting. I mean, this whole issue, I mean, this is what you're an expert on at the moment. I know you've had a long career. But this issue of hybrid threats, of cyber war, of disinformation, you know, was everyone asleep at the wheel when it came to that? Or how damaging do you think that has been? And what kind of tactics has Russia been using that people maybe were never aware of?
Well, they've been using multiple tactics. And I think what we've missed the importance of this battle of ideas. In a way, the reason Kiev stood because Ukraine was able to kind of give that idea of will of people to fight. That is still the way of the war. The will of the people matters really. And in a way, in that disinformation, that is exactly what is tried to be suppressed. But I'll share with quite a very recent anecdotal situation which kind of leads to what might be the answers. Recently, a group of international journalists got access to the secret Kremlin plans to influence 3 Baltic states, surprise, surprise, from 21. And there were many elements in there, but to my own personal, quite a surprise, I've read the threat to the fulfillment of the Kremlin plans in the Baltics is the center I lead.
Oh, right.
So in a way, kind of apart from patting myself on our people on the shoulder, I think the wider idea is if you have a capability and have demonstrated it, it is seen as a deterrent. So in that way, I would argue many countries have not really invested properly and have not demonstrated that capability. And I would say that is a way to go.
I mean, we're seeing it, for example, it's quite a focus at the moment on Moldova, for example. They're dealing with this all the time, and it's a real problem. On that, just picking up, you were saying about the will of Ukraine to fight, which is obviously crucial to the way this war has panned out. But also, I mean, returning to part of the title of our talk, building resilience through preparation. I mean, it's also been about the willingness of the West, and particularly the US, to arm Ukraine and to pull off that balancing act of not antagonizing Moscow to the point of anything worse, and yet giving them the equipment. Now Ukraine says it needs more. But what's your thoughts, Antonia, about resilience, about this build-up of resources by NATO countries and by the West?
Well, I think there are several layers to look into this, and it actually ties very well with deterrence. Obviously, that's the title. You know, it's logic. But point one is to basically know the way that Russia is going to engage, Russia is going to attack. And with regards to that, it's normal that when you have a war, you have propaganda, you have disinformation campaigns. However, Russia has started well before the war in Ukraine, the kinetic war in Ukraine, which makes us believe that it will continue after the war in Ukraine, even if we win, and I hope we will win the war in Ukraine. I don't see Russia stopping because Russia's strategy is tied, and Russia's existence is tied to fighting the West and its influence in the borderland. That said, I think we are going to see more ramifications of what we've already seen. So, for instance, if so far disinformation campaigns have pointed to the political realm of things, now we are going to see more and more of a shift in the economic side of things. As we have actually seen with regards to all kinds of messaging and all kinds of campaigning related to the way sanctions are working or not working in Russia, related to the ways that we are touched by sanctions. Pro-Russian influencers, for instance, especially in the borderline countries, especially in places like Moldova, are pointing out the ways that the sanctions are diminishing our capabilities and our stability. Now, obviously, there is some truth in all these, right? This is why there is the disinformation campaign going on, and this is why certain topics are being selected. More than that, with regards to resilience, what we have to do, apart from communicating exactly what we do so that the public is prepared to get the messaging from Russia as it is, as propaganda, I think it is important for us to build our foundation in terms of an integrated critical infrastructure that supports societal development. And when I say that, I don't mean that critical infrastructure is only energy or intermodal infrastructure. Of course we need that. That's the basics. But on top of that, we need coordination. We need to understand each other on the borderline on what has actually become the new containment line, talking about deterrence in the 21st century. Also, with regards to the economy, it's obvious these days when we are talking about the grain problems, we do need to protect ourselves as well.
This is the imports that are coming in from Ukraine, the grain imports into those Eastern European Union countries.
Yes, and some of it, I believe, is also tied to the campaigning that Russia is doing with regards to how the matter is being perceived in our own media.
That's interesting.
And that's where we need to focus next, because the way that we react to stuff like this is going to either make us stronger or make us vulnerable.
I mean, it's interesting just for people who are not maybe covering or following that in detail. I mean, on another panel I was on yesterday, it came up, the whole issue of Ukraine's accession to the EU, for example. This is the first time we've seen some of the EU countries kind of break with Ukraine on this. So it's ironically, the countries that were the most supportive of Ukraine, like Poland, they're now faced with very unhappy farmers in their own country who are faced with this influx of cheap Ukrainian grain that's depressing the price. And the European Union Commission is now, as we speak, trying to desperately get a package together to try and keep everyone happy. So it's quite an interesting moment that there could, divisions could open up here at this moment. But how that's perceived or how that's presented by Russia, as you point out, is also an interesting angle.
And I just something else to add on this. It's quite natural that after 1 year of the war, we are seeing that there is a threat to Ukraine becoming grayer. There is also that is one topic that is not very much talked in the media, as we are seeing. It's a war zone, right? Some of the countries controlled de facto by Russia. Part of the country is controlled by Russia. Some is in war, and the other half is basically focusing on the war. So bottom line, we are seeing the repercussions of the war in Ukraine, and we are seeing Ukraine getting a target to the black, not to the black market, but a target to the trafficking businesses of all kinds, okay? So that imposes the question of how do we deal with this, us, the neighbors, us, the European Union. And that is also tied to the grain element. Like, how do we know that that grain is actual de facto Ukrainian grain and it's not Russian?
And the EU are saying, well, this is a very specific thing because that grain is supposed to go to the developing countries and wasn't supposed to stay here, so they're trying to sort that out. But still,
I think the two elements that we probably need to distinguish. One is the actual policy and what happens with the grain, and then what is the Russian on top of that narrative. And I think with the second, it is not that difficult to deal with, in fact. And that's one of the things when I look at the Russia, and we've been looking a lot for years at Russia, there's not much new in their playbook. So in a way, what you do, you have to understand what is the infrastructure within the information environment that Russia uses for their own interest and advances. You have to monitor, you have to expose. When necessary, intelligence has to be very open about what they find in the kind of people being agents of influence. It has to go all transparent. And when we've seen in a number of countries in our region, we have been very much under this pressure, how we evolve in developing certain resilience in these cases. And in some cases, well, also in our parts, they use the existing political problems and try to piggyback on them. By just correlating that with Russia might disrupt the way the political problem is perceived. So there are instruments. So my point is about cooperation and exchange. There's, in that world, not much is new under the sun. And in a way, exchanging the best practice can do a lot.
It's one useful way to build up that resilience. On the more traditional idea of resilience as well, I mean, it's the age-old question, but the 2% of GDP spending. I mean, has this been a bit of a watershed moment, an awakening for Europe? And do you think that European countries now are finally going to say, right, we are prioritising this, the defence spending, it's happening, we're no longer going to be free riding on the US? I mean, do you think this has served to bolster that?
To a certain extent, but I think to think that all NATO nations will be spending 2% in any foreseeable time would be daydreaming. But I think there is a strong increase per the expenditure. Yeah. I think we've seen clearly all the kind of countries that are on the periphery or close to Russia have been really surpassing significantly in 2%. But I think increasingly it is not the question of money. Increasingly, it is a question of industrial capacity, especially within Europe. It's been addressed in a number of other panels. But by and large, how do you build credible deterrence if your industrial capacity takes you for about 1 to 2 months, and that's it? Yeah. So that is, I think, a deeper question that has to be addressed separately.
Antonia, your view on this, building up resilience in terms of defence capabilities, do you think it's a bit of a watershed moment?
I mean, it is, because we are thinking in Europe seriously about cooperation. And in that sense, on defense, I mean, in that sense, I believe it is, a changing mood, at least, with regards to strategy and strategic thinking at the level of European Union and the level of European Union leaders. Now, it is daydreaming to think that everyone is going to throw in money. And I believe that's not the goal. The goal is to build capabilities. The goal is to build interoperability. The goal is to know how to defend ourselves and what are the threats. Obviously, Spain or France is not going to have the very same threat as Romania, strategically, and that is understood. That is why we are an alliance, because we need to know what is needed when and how. And that in Europe, I believe it is now getting to be understood. Now, not to say, you know, I'm an Eastern European person myself. I come from Romania. And obviously, even if I try to be objective, I have some sensitivity to the region. But all things considered, the frontier countries stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea have done major steps in, you know, in cooperating and in understanding how to build up capabilities, precisely because we have a common threat, and that has been the driver.
If I may add here a slightly provocative, if probably more so, thought. I think it's not abstract deterrence. NATO gives deterrence, and frankly, I would argue right now EU doesn't have that.
Yeah.
And I think we have to really understand, because it's quite a marked, important difference. And the way it goes, I actually see it more exacerbated in the future rather than somehow dealt with. So if we speak about collective West, we might argue we have a deterrence. NATO has a deterrence factor, but I don't think it extends as far as EU.
I suppose, putting my, you know, Brussels hat on as a commentator and a journalist, in a way, the EU's deterrence is its economy, is its power as a trading bloc. Now, in a way, you could say one of Europe's big mistake was that got imbalanced, and Europe ended up being dependent on Russia very, very concretely on gas supplies. But, you know, its economic weight means that, you know, people can't really ignore it. It's one of the biggest trading blocs in the world.
Critical element to developing deterrence and your ability to think and decide strategically. And that is one of the issues with the EU. It is very rarely the case when the nations can come up and see that in that perspective. And when we think about practical, realistic deterrence, it always requires that kind of approach. For instance, if we look at current emerging technologies, as AI, that will be one of the key drivers of future deterrence. Europe is distant third. And like speaking a lot, doing not as much.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right in saying, you know, this lack of strategy. I mean, it's a cliche, but the European Union often only moves forward at a moment of crisis. It takes like the Eurozone crisis or the migration to actually come forward with a policy. It just kind of ambles along because it's so hard to get agreement among 27 countries because it's such a unique kind of a entity in that way. Antonia, just shifting slightly, I would like to get your views. I mean, we're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine here, but also we've got this whole theme of deterrence. It's also very relevant to what's happening in Asia. And we just, in the last 24 hours or so, we see this meeting that happened between the South Korean leader and Joe Biden in the US. And the US announced plans to send more nuclear-capable bombers and other assets temporarily to South Korea. What's your reading of the China threat? Very much what the US sees as a major threat from China and the whole concept of deterrence there.
Well, I think I would tie it to the economy more than anything. And that is particularly because China is very much dependent on Europe and the US. And at the same time, we have a global economic war going on, which includes the discussion about how China reacts to Ukraine economically by partnering Russia or not partnering Russia. That is the question mark. And visibly, they are partnering some of Russian goals. They are not partnering others. They have distanced themselves until yesterday with regards to Ukraine. When there was a signal from Xi that, you know, we want to talk with Ukraine directly. That is pretty much on the Western agenda. So it is basically the pressure of economics that has to give us hints in Asia. At the same time, the very pressure of economics these days, in particular connected to the global economic war, is tied to trade and investment corridors. trade corridors that Russia is building, north-south corridor, but also the Arctic corridor that both actually have at their center Asia. And it is not just about Russia dealing with China. It is about Russia trying to posture itself in places like South China Sea as a potential partner for countries like Vietnam, like, you know. So it's basically these small steps that make the South China Sea another geopolitical node, if you will, in regards to how vulnerable our world economy is if China shifts towards Russia, and if the current trade conflict in between the US and China is becoming larger. And that is actually, and I'll go full circle to what you were saying earlier about the European Union power in the softer sense of economy. That is driving us all in Europe and in the West to basically consider protectionism. It has been on the table for a long time. Because during the pandemic, we basically had this question mark. But now we are thinking more seriously also because we are in the global economic war and we need to protect ourselves. So this is affecting the investment corridors.
Yeah. And I mean, the US, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, he's been, you know, spearheading this idea of a more, I suppose, protectionist economic priority. What's your view? I mean, what's the NATO view on China? Obviously, China is preoccupying NATO to much more of an extent than it has been previously.
Oh, of course it does, and it has been specifically mentioned as a risk in strategic concept. So also we as a center, we do a lot of work on the way China evolves. And what we would say is, from the different kinds of researches, I think what we understand, the point of departure of the Xi's idea is how to keep control of the Communist Party over China. And through that prism, the rest of the policies should have been seen. I think we should also kind of, while discussing China, kind of recognize the kind of shift Communist Party did relative to the big businesses. And for us, looking at the way, for instance, emerging technologies are being developed, it actually hurt quite a lot the Chinese kind of development. But certainly, even during the early days of pandemic, we suddenly saw a quite a quick rise of a Chinese disinformation infrastructure throughout Europe, in some regions more, in some regions less. And of course, they're still catching up after Russia, which is more preeminent actor. But the fact that they are establishing themselves is very important, not to mention the technological aspect of the competition/conflict, which is where we look at the potential use of platforms like TikTok, not only individually kind of getting data about ministers, but actually the way you can shift the societal opinions by just having an access to algorithm, or the way the algorithm prefers one or another thing. And this is a, I think, not fully recognized area of competition, which is very much about the values we perceive, which is what we say, democratic approach to the information, and authoritarian, which is all about the control and government kind of tickling with everything.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, there's another threat, which is the nuclear expansion by China over the last while. I mean, you know, we're talking at the beginning, as we come to the end of the session, we're kind of, again, gone back full circle to this kind of traditional idea of deterrence, this Cold War, nuclear deterrent. But, you know, China now is emerging as a possible player now. I mean, is that a concern?
Well, they have been all the time the player. But I think the risk appetites of China and Russia differ, at least in my judgment. And in a sense, it makes sense. Russia is declining power by any means, and now they're declining really fast, and as such is a risk taker. China sees itself as ascending power And in a way, the risk is not worth it, because tomorrow might be a better day for us versus the world or versus the US. So at this moment, I don't see that as a same category as we've seen Russia recklessly using nuclear rhetorics, threatening, and even kind of doing these exercisings. But frankly, when you look at what they really were doing with their nuclear exercises, they've been provocative for a long time.
Okay, and finally, Antonia, just on this, I mean, you make a good point there about China's thinking that is very different than Russia's, Jānis. And I mean, in a way, one could see that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that by all measures has not been a success for Russia, maybe as a warning to China. I mean, I know you can't make that crude analogy between Taiwan and Ukraine, but obviously, but this idea of overstretching and rolling the dice, this risk that Russia took, do you think that's played maybe on China's calculations, or how do you think China views this whole issue of its geopolitical role? And
I don't think we should necessarily tie Chinese strategy to what's going on in Ukraine. I think that China, if you look at the map, China is both a maritime and a continental power. And it is stretching to be both. It is trying to grow in both directions. Russia is not. Russia is pretty much landlocked. Therefore, the vision of the world of Russia taken by Moscow, differs very much of the vision that Beijing has. So Beijing is looking at what's going on in Ukraine in terms of risk and opportunity. So it is very well, I believe, calculating what its risks are with regards to working with Russia temporarily or not working with Russia, working with the US or not working with the US. So in a way, Russia made China more aware, if it needed to be more aware, of its power in the balancing act. And that is something that we need to live with in the future. So even if Ukraine is not triggering anything to the South China Sea and to Taiwan in particular, Ukraine has triggered the knowledge of Beijing in the sense of, I am important and I'm really the dealer in some issues, and I can act on some issues alone.
So a new reality. Okay, well, thank you for that final thought. Antonia, Jānis, thanks very much for that discussion, and thank you, everyone in the audience, for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.